Then the question is, who's holding these title deeds? Who's holding all of these financing? It's largely on a government side. Then the question is, the South African government has to begin transferring long-term tradable lists to people, and has to begin to transferring title deeds to some. And it has also to understand that not everyone will be a farmer. We have to select someone that can optimize that level of farming and actually do some work onto that.
The agricultural industry is one of the most important in South Africa, not just in the present day, but if you look at the history of the country, the development of the industry has been vital for economic growth, for job creation. In that context, we want to talk a little bit about the state of agriculture in 2023 here on the CRA YouTube channel. And who better to get than one of South Africa's foremost agricultural economists, writers, someone who understands the sector maybe like no one else, Wandile Sihlobo. Wandile is the chief economist of the Agricultural Business Chamber of South Africa and the author of two books. Number one, Finding Common Ground, Land, Equity and Agriculture. And the second one, which you can see behind me and which is the focus of our discussion today, A Country of Two Agricultures, The Disparities, the Challenges and the Solutions. Wandile, thank you so much for your time with the CRA this week. Just to start off with this new book of yours, congratulations. I'd like to start a little bit on what was the sort of driver, the inspiration for wanting to write this book? Of course, we can read lots of your articles, we can read lots of your analysis on a weekly basis, some of which I will link in the description below. But why particularly delve into something as in-depth as a book?
Chris, first of all, thanks for doing this, man, and for the organization for bringing me on. I think for the whole thing, it's layered. Perhaps maybe I'll put it in two ways. The first part is that, Chris, in South Africa today, we find ourselves at a point where we're saying, look, our economy is not growing. Unemployment is a big challenge. Poverty is a big challenge. And we are searching to say, where are the sources of growth? What can we do where to see this country going forward? And I thought bringing agriculture into the mainstream discussion ever more so through the book or any other channel is an important thing to do. But then, of course, with the book, it assists on saying, how do you distill then this discussion about agriculture and its possibilities for growth in a much more palatable way for a bigger audience? That was the first reason about underscoring this point onto the book. The second reason, of course, about why is this book, I guess it's clear from its title that it is a country of two agricultures. And this, Chris, ties down into the history of South Africa. We have a painful history, we all understand that. But then the question is to say, if we are to suggest that agriculture can grow and keep South Africa going forward, then how do we close the dualism that is there? Where you have white farmers that are in a more commercial space, and you have black farmers that are more in a smallholder farming side. But how do you build then a sector that is growing significantly and closing on this dualism? That was the general theme about why to write the book. But I had to ensure that if I'm going to have then that discussion, it shouldn't be dry and boring and academic. Because now you're saying this is a book not for farmers or anyone. It's a book for all people that care about South Africa. Then you have to write about it in a more palatable way for everyone to see value into this. That was the approach that I took on it, Chris.
In terms of agriculture in 2023, how do you sort of see the landscape? I know it's a very broad question. There are many avenues even of agriculture. One shouldn't assume agriculture is the same across the board. You've got so many different forms of it, the small, the commercial, that sort of thing. What do you think about the sector at the moment, and maybe some of the biggest challenges that you want to highlight?
I'm very positive about the sector at the moment, Chris. I mean, when we look at it, we have been fortunate to have good rainfalls and everything else that have assisted us that in 2023, we have the second largest harvest in our agricultural output in the history of this country. So from that perspective, I think we've done reasonably well. But I think what's more important, which is, of course, when you're putting on a book, you're not putting it on an event basis, but rather to say, pushing us forward where the prospects are. If one looks at today, they will hear us in the next few months talking about El Nino, droughts, and all of those things. That may be the possibility. But I think someone has to look at agriculture and know that's an event matter. But when you're thinking about long term, the next 10 years, we see this sector growing and expanding from its current value by anything between 15 to 20% on a gross value added. So there's much more exciting things that are yet to come here. And it will come in a number of ways. There's still more land that we can till and bring more people into production side of the agricultural system. There's more opportunities that lie in a value chain. So there's a lot of good things that we are positive about that will be happening in South Africa's agriculture.
Wandile, we all of us could spend a lot of time talking about the challenges that the country faces. I think rightly so. One should acknowledge these and try and tackle them in the best ways possible. In terms of success stories, drawing again attention to the broader idea of the book, your two different agricultures, a bit of success stories around supporting and bringing in emerging Black farmers, entrepreneurs in the space. Are there any of those sort of stories that you would like to highlight? Maybe pilot projects, things around security of property, that sort of thing that you think South Africans should know about?
I mean, I think, Chris, the broad point to start on here is that when one looks at South Africa's agriculture at the moment and you ask yourself, what's the contribution of Black farmers into the commercial output in South Africa? I mean, the point is clear on the book, right in the opening pages where I make it that to say, look, Black farmers on average contribute just slightly less than 10% of the commercial output. But then you have two choices there. You either, get upset about that, or you either try to understand and say, okay, we see that, but we are trying to build the country here, and farming is a long-term endeavor. Why is the progress so slow? What can we do in a sustainable way, knowing that we are all responsible for this country to actually get things going? And this is where then it lands on those examples to say, yes, while on average the number is disappointing, but you shouldn't look at it in that way. You should drill down and say, are all the value chains like that? Are all the regions like that? But when we look into that, then there are regions that are doing reasonably well. Then the key thing in a book was to say, how do you study the commonalities in those? And how do you think about financing, and how do you think about incubation? How do you think about land policy? Because property rights are central if you are to think about creating a new crop of Black farmers. And I think the other thing here, which is important, is about this thing in South Africa where when we think about transformation, we usually think about it in a zero-sum game to say you are moving from a white farmer to a Black farmer. But given that we have roughly over 2.5 million hectares of land that can actually come into production in various commodities and value chains in agriculture. Here you are almost talking about growing the South African agricultural pie, which is what the book proposes on. And of course, outlining about what needs to be done to pretty much get through those hurdles and get as many people as possible to participate effectively in the sector.
Wandile, just a question around sort of macroeconomics and the supporting infrastructure for farmers, both those who are more established, but especially for emerging farmers, getting some of those basics right. So, I mean, the easiest for me to highlight is maybe logistics, the electricity issue, of course, maybe crime and security. What do you think of those sorts of areas? Have I left anything out, or is there anything else that South Africans should be aware of? Because maybe we take for granted the challenges that farmers across the board have to face on a day-to-day basis. Maybe we don't appreciate them nearly enough in the work that they do.
I mean, I outlined some of those points in the book, Chris, because of course, then we some of the things we take for granted, as you rightly say, but sometimes we also talk primarily only about the land and forget that it's much more bigger than that. The issue of agricultural finance is a big one. Infrastructure, when you think about the roads, railway lines, because all of those effectively influence the transaction cost of moving a product from a farm into the consumption point. There's rising crime in South Africa. You talk to a farmer in Bizana, in Sikisiki, in Limpopo, everywhere, stock theft and all of those. These are things that needs to pretty much be resolved on this. And there's also some regulatory matters that are there that needs to be resolved within the Department of Agriculture, water, and all of that to make sure that the environment at which farmers are participating on is much more better and effective. But I would also outline another issue here, Chris, which is the fact when you think about these two agricultures in South Africa, the disparities are not only just on a black and white, but they are also regionalized. Some of the provinces that have former homelands, you think about the Eastern Cape, KZN, and parts of Limpopo, you see that they are the ones that actually have a much more bigger drag in as far as the agricultural progress. More so the Eastern Cape, where you see that it's sitting in the periphery of agricultural development. And that is, of course, partially by the factors that I've outlined, but there's also a softer issue of the institutions in these provinces. That gets to be very important, either for incubation of farmers, making sure that there's organized farmer structures, and all of these systems that enable us to have a thriving agricultural sector. And in addition to that, to have the value chain that is important in there. So these are all the missing gaps. And then the question is all about thinking about this to say, how do you bring the incubation house? How do you bring better innovative financial methods? Who should be doing what on infrastructure? These are questions we should be grappling with, in addition to some of the problems that have long been in the public debate in South Africa.
Wandile, this is me indulging in a personal area of interest, but trade and the movement of goods and of people and facilitating the ease of trade, the first thing that jumps to mind is the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. The link might be too tenuous on my part, but do you delve at all into how maybe the AfCFTA could assist agricultural development in South Africa and sub-Saharan Africa?
Yeah, I mean, one of the strongest part of the book, and these are the words of Professor Nick Fink at Stellenbosch University, who helped me with the review of the book. He felt that one of the strengths of the book is actually on this theme of trade, which is on the second part of the book where we delve onto this. And there, I mean, my view is also just to be cautious, because you talk to politicians in South Africa and a number of colleagues, they all sound excited to say, look, African Continental Free Trade Agreement, opportunities, we will do well. But things aren't exactly as we think, because moving the commodities across the African continent is still pretty much a hassle. Compared, I mean, me sending somewhere in their continent compared to sending something to Japan, it becomes easier to get to Japan. There's a payment situations that are there. There's a higher movement of the goods to these countries. There's an infrastructural constraints, both physical and soft infrastructure. So these are things that I think we are not as cognizant a lot about. And I mean, in agriculture, we're already gaining a lot in as far as trade with Africa, because if you look at how much South Africa exports as we speak today, South Africa exports about half of what we produce in value terms. That's for 2022 was about $12.8 billion of agricultural products. Of course, 40% in Africa, and then you have 20% in the EU and the other regions of the world. But if you were to drill down and say, what is that in Africa? Where is it going? Almost 90% of it is within the SADC region. And that tells you then that you trade much more with those people that are in your proximity. Infrastructure is already established. And of course, we are all in the same area, trading area there, which assisted us to an extent. But I think the moment you go beyond that, you look at their diets and the diversity according to what we produce in South Africa. You look at the income. If anything, I would think the African Continental Free Trade Agreement will benefit South Africa 10 years down the line in as far as agriculture, rather than the optimism that people place on the near term. And there's many more things that in the book, when they dive deeper, they will see the technical arguments that we are presenting there, which yield me to have a slightly more cautious view when I think about this and the continent.
Wandile, a broader question just around policy and something that has been the focus a lot in South African agriculture, but also the economy, on expropriation without compensation. Just your thoughts maybe on how that is developing, whether we'll have sort of certainty in that regard, but also in your view, if there's some aspects of restitution that have been done successfully. I think many South Africans would want to see successful restitution projects where it's not just a case of you expect emerging farmers to succeed on their own without the supporting infrastructure, all that sort of thing. Just broadly on that point, how do you see that at play at the moment?
I mean, look, I think as South Africa, Chris, it's important that we understand that land reform is a imperative. It's something that we have to do. The question then is always to say, why has land reform been reasonably slower than perhaps what people had predicted, as well as what's the best path forward? And I do think that also as South Africans, we have we have a tendency to exaggerate some of the things. I mean, for example, in the book, we do talk about how much land has been transferred from white farmers to Black South Africans, which at this point it's roughly around about 25% instead of the 9% that many people talk about when we think about the farming land onto that. But then the question is to say, if then you say 25%, but on commercial output, you're talking about 10% of the agricultural products produced by Black South Africans, what's the story there? The story goes into this point of saying, are we making those farms to be productive? And most of them, they are not as productive as they would have been. And the blame usually to farmers to say, look, these fellows don't know how to farm. And I think that's unfair to make comments like that, because folks get into the farms and they go to these farms without the proper support, without title deeds, without proper infrastructural support, and all of that constrain them, because South Africa's agricultural production is highly capital intensive. But then the question is, who's holding these title deeds? Who's holding all of these financing? It's largely on a government side. Then the question is, the South African government has to begin transferring long-term tradable lists to people, and has to begin to transferring title deeds to some. And it has also to understand that not everyone will be a farmer. We have to select someone that can optimize that level of farming and actually do some work onto that. And the question about whether you should expropriate or anything, I think that should be off the table, because you have to protect the property right.
And Wandile, just as a final question, we could go on for 3 hours, but I actually want people to, this is more of a teaser for them to go and buy the book and read it for themselves and discuss the issues, buy copies for their friends, their communities, try and get the information out there. Just a final parting thought on your side, maybe of what you see about the prospects for agriculture, how you feel about things going forward, and just in your own words, sort of to whom would you recommend to go and buy and read the book?
Chris, A Country of Two Agricultures is a book for everyone. It's not just a book for farmers, for people in the food, fiber, and beverages value chain, or researchers or politicians. It is the book for all those people that care about the progress and development of South Africa, because it offers, of course, the rural economy, but also other things that are embedded in the political economy of South Africa. So I would recommend it for everyone on that. And it carries a number of suggestions about how do we drive then the rural economy in South Africa to see the million jobs that the NDP had talked about, to add 15 to 30% in the gross value added of the rural economy in South Africa. And of course, close this divide and dualism that is there in farming and agro-processing. And I would recommend everyone to go and get the book and engage with the text. But I'm so grateful for the opportunity to have this conversation with you.
Thank you very much for watching. A reminder, please, before you leave, to like this video, share it amongst your friends, your communities, and your contacts. And if you haven't yet, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. Until next time, this has been Chris Hattingh for the Center for Risk Analysis. Take care.